Hello and welcome to this new chapter. In this chapter, we will consider what bioethics can do for emotional well-being. So in this case, we reverse the position we were taking before, and we will consider what would be good for bioethics to do in order to increase our well-being, our emotional stability, and in order to fulfill the goal of bioethics, according to Potter, that is sustainable well-being for ourselves and our environment. So, for example, one case I consider in my book, The Role of Bioethics in Emotional Problems, is the cost of narcissism or narcissistic traits for the environment. It's a very difficult cost to quantify, but certainly narcissistic traits and the dismissive way with which they engage with the environment generates an exploitation of the environment that is concerning. So in my writing, for example, I brought the example of the tragedy of the commons. If if given the chances to freely use a common resource, people with narcissistic traits would overuse the common resources, even if they don't actually need it. So the problem of the commons, that in literature has been resolved as a problem that is self-balancing, because people would use common sense in using common resources, since they can actually perceive how these resources need to be used by everyone. So I'm thinking of water, forests, gas, minerals, and so on. It's not such an easy problem to solve with the rise of narcissistic traits in our society. I don't know, I'm thinking about Eric Fromm, Lowen, Alexander Lowen, and their criticism of our society, and they were writing in the 1980s. And how shocking was for them to see that the society was taking more and more the shape of a narcissistic society, where this disengagement with the environment became more and more stronger and stronger. So this is a real problem. And it's a problem that do not pertain just to sociology, psychology, or I don't know, anthropology. I mean, it's a problem for bioethics as well, because it affects directly our well-being, for the environment, for I don't know, the medical system in which we're working, the professional environment for which we serve. I mean, it's a very pervasive problem we should start thinking of. So bioethics could promote policies that facilitate healthy connection with the environment and would facilitate an upbringing that is caring, meaning for what it concerns the healthy connection with the environment, bioethics might conceive of, might propose a way to educate children to spend more time with the environment, with what is outside of their little house, to create and promote a healthy connection with the environment. What we saw often is that if you are born in a poor neighborhood, very rarely would you see anything green, or you would consider your environment as a resource. It would be more often something that takes something away from you. And also the upbringing, meaning, again, if you are born in a family that have to meet both ends, that have to gain for survival, it might happen that this family will not have enough time to spend with the child because, yeah, work is a must. Again, an interdisciplinary subject matter as bioethics is should work in collaboration with different disciplines in order to devise ideas to slow down the fast pace with which we are normalizing narcissistic traits in our environment. We cannot think of having a healthy environment, a healthy life, if we are getting sicker and sicker. If the people who make choices, CEOs, political leaders, um, important professionals, have to develop narcissistic traits in order to cope with certain difficulties, I think that bioethics can start thinking about these problems. Restlessness. This is another very common problem that we see almost every day, and we don't take into serious consideration, or at least not enough serious consideration as it should be. What is restlessness? Difficult to define with the use of Henri and Levinas. I define restlessness as losing one's home. And this home could be the real place, or it could be a metaphorical place. Um, you start feeling restless when you are not safe in your own body or in the place in which you live, when you feel that there's no place where to come back to and you have to keep moving in order to survive. And this kind of restlessness, for example, is quite evident in problems like Ulysses syndrome, which is a relatively new syndrome discussed in Ashotegui writing, which has been published right now in 2020, but there were older articles in the 70s, in which he basically says, surprisingly, immigrants all suffer from the same chronic disease. Do we want to take this pattern into consideration? Do we want to reflect a bit on what is behind this chronic disease that immigrants tend to suffer from in any country in the world? Here, Schultz can give some food for thoughts in saying, in noticing there's his beautiful essays on home commerce. I think it's from 1945, in which he describes the migration process as a process that destroys your system of habitualizations. Meaning, when you live for all your life in the same place, or at least in the same country, there are things that you do without having to put thought into that. Taking a coffee at a bar, exchanging a talk with somebody else, getting dressed, finding, I don't know, your doctor, and so on. These are all huge tasks that have to be undertaken when you are an immigrant. And I know that I'm talking to a community that somehow knows what I'm talking about, because we as scholars and researchers somehow have to develop resilience in readjusting to new places. And we are first class immigrants because more or less we are not escaping from war zones or places where political crimes are happening every day without being convicted or even considered. Nevertheless, we know how difficult it is to readjust. So, what Schultz is saying is that once you migrate, there's a new system of habitualizations that needs to be built. And this requires an intense mental effort that cannot be displaced into anything else. I mean, if I have to understand how to communicate my need for food, clearly I cannot make informed choices about more refined expressions of values, meanings, emotions, intentions. In his beautiful article, Achotegui was citing the experience of a woman who developed at some point. She was from the Moluccan Islands. She developed at some point psychotic disorders. And she was living in Holland, I believe, and the network around her was there to provide support, but the support was mostly medicalized. She was receiving pills, antidepressants mostly, and her diagnosis was getting worse and worse. I mean, she was developing more problems rather than fixing the pre-existing ones. At some point, her brother, who was still at her original place, decide to bring her back because he's in fact the only one who understands that her main problem was connected to the fact that she couldn't mourn the loss of her father, which happened to be 1 year earlier the development of these psychosis. So she was so busy in adjusting to the new place that more sophisticated emotional process like mourning the loss of a dear person did not have the space to happen. And in coming back, she felt better. Her problems, her chronic problems, which mostly are headaches, stomach problems, recurrent colds and flus. So we are talking about really small problems that lower your energy on average. Are the result of this intense effort to readjust. And in this intense effort, emotions quite rarely can take a place. Losing that center, the center that we recognize as our home, which could be again the physical place or our emotional place, means losing our ability to be the subject of our decisions, the subjects of the constitution of our meanings, and to respond for what we do in front of others, to be able to make meanings that create sense for ourselves and others. Now, with my philosophical counseling practice, I feel quite lucky somehow because yeah, mostly I work in Switzerland and in the Bay Area, and both places are the recipient of an interesting migrating population. And often I assist to this kind of problems and I help my client to regain the constitution of meanings of their own lived experiences, to create sense for all the actions that they do not have time to process, and also to give them the connection to make this first center of habitualizations steady and ready as soon as possible. Now, what does bioethics have to do with all this? Ecco, bioethics, I think, could at least help in creating a centered health system. Now, this is a very thorny topic, and I think there are different points of view in relation to this topic, and there's a wide literature. But I think that start thinking of a health system that is centralized and more or less similar for everyone, with different regionalisms according to, of course, the culture, the values in which you're living, would make the survival of these individuals slightly better. If somebody suffering from Ulysses syndrome or just feeling restless in the way in which we described before, fall sick, it's very, very hard for this person to receive help because they do not trust the health system, or they do not work how the health system can function, or they do not belong to that health system because they are not citizen. There's, for example, the usual problem of immigrants in Italy who do not go to the hospital just because they don't know that the hospital is for free. And they could receive treatment if they are entitled to receive treatment if they go there. But often they develop much more significant illnesses because they are afraid of going to receive care. Or there's the other little problem of biotic strains. So if you travel from one place to another, of course, the strains of um, antibiotics that you're going to receive are different according to the place. Nevertheless, nobody would actually concern about the kind of antibiotic strains you are receiving in that moment. You are required to adjust immediately to the notion of well-being that is in that place without putting any thought into what this adjustment actually means. So an intelligent health system that does not have as main concern profit, but actual well-being, and is somewhat in dialogue with other health systems and creates a centralized way of proceeding, can help this society that is clearly, as a matter of fact, becoming more and more fluid, more and more in transit, in movement. Pretending that this problem does not exist just raises other problems to come. Emotional numbness. This is another a common problem that I happen to handle in my private practice, and I saw very common in literature. It might happen that a person develops what has been called the beige feeling. So life moves on fast. You have to adjust to the external social script. You don't have time to reflect on what you actually desire, on what you actually want for yourself in your life, on, I don't know, the meaning of a certain trauma in your life and how you should process that. So you just develop this sense of numbness because you feel that you have to adjust to the social script, to something important that is external, to the life as it goes, because otherwise you can't catch up. And so the numbness, and so suddenly you don't feel anything anymore. And here in my study, I found a very interesting online forum where people described what emotional numbness is for them. And some of them said, well, I would rather be depressed rather than feeling this emotional numbness, because at least with depression, I would feel something. This is absolutely nothing. And it's important to see how behind emotional numbness is this paradox of exclusion. When we are excluded, you might think that the actual outcome of exclusion is, feeling rage, offended, upset. The actual outcome of being excluded is to exclude yourself, meaning when you are excluded, there's this sense of shame, of stigma, um, um, of resentment that leads you to say, yeah, okay, you exclude me. Okay, so I exclude myself from that circle. I don't want you to exclude me. I will exclude myself. I will go to a better place. So when there's a traumatic event that severes the connection that put us together in a certain environment, what we do is not to fight against this exclusion, but is the creation of a paler reality where we find ourselves living without the sense of shame, guilt, resentment that exclusion created, or that traumatic exclusion created. So it happens quite often that we encounter this paradox of exclusion in bioethical cases without even realizing it. So we consider uh, the protagonists of some medical cases as acting in a weird, apathetic way without taking into consideration the outcome that a trauma can create on emotion, and without considering the impact of emotional numbness that the traumatic experience and the way in which this traumatic experience is handled on the single individuals. Now, I will give you a case to understand better what I'm talking about. Here, there's this very interesting case cited by Schenk and Roscoe. I will summarize at its essence the case. They mention the case of a child born premature from a couple of teenagers, extremely young. This child, this baby, is born with congenital disorders. The mother, nevertheless, wants to keep feeding the baby, wants to take care of the baby, and she ignores the suggestion from the hospital to hospitalize the child in order to provide enough food for the baby. At the first visit, or at the second, I think, at the second visit, the mother is asked to hospitalize the baby because they notice that the baby is not receiving enough food. Even if she doesn't want to hospitalize the baby, because it seems from the narrative, which is of course very emotionally dry and a little bit biased to my point of view, it seems to me that the mother of the baby and her family are already at peace with the idea that this baby is very sick, and they have a very short time together to enjoy this baby. But anyway, she consents to the hospitalization of the baby. The father of the baby is not together, is not in a relationship with the mother, but they go to visit the baby separately. At some point, the baby starts feeling worse and worse, and here you see how the emotional numbness kicks in. So the mother starts visiting the baby only when it's night. The father drops the visits more and more often. The medical staff gets more and more frustrated because they have to make decisions that should expect to the parents of the baby. Nevertheless, they try to communicate with the parents through text, and they start assuming a certain judgmental attitude toward the parents because they are young, they are teenagers. So they assume that their unresponding behavior is due to their age and to a certain carelessness toward the situation. For this reason, they ask the mother of the mother, so the grandmother of this baby on the part of the mother, to care for the situation and to be somewhat responsive for what was going on. At some point, both the grandmother and the mother of the baby express the will to discharge the baby from the hospital because they want to live their last days with their babies at home. This is not possible because the baby is in crisis, so they keep having the baby under their care, and they feel more and more frustrated because they start not receiving answers from the mother either, from the grandmother, the mother of the mother. And this generates a higher sense of responsibility on the part of the medical staff and a general sense of frustration because they have to make choices that otherwise they couldn't make. Long story short, the baby dies. They have to make the choice of ending, of unplug the devices to keep him alive. The whole family would go there to say goodbye to the baby when the medical staff personnel is not there. I found this article, this case extremely interesting because I think it happens quite often that the emotional pain, the emotional neutrality of people involved in medical cases is interpreted as carelessness, while instead hides this paradox of self-exclusion, which is extremely painful for the people involved. So, what bioethics could do is to try to bring emotions a little bit more to the surface when analyzing the characters involved in certain choices. So, now, yeah, we have a certain awareness of the ethical habits and religious habits that might move certain choices. So, the refusal for blood transfusions from Jehovah believers, for example. Okay, but I think that bioethics can do a better job in understanding the numbness that hides behind the rationality of certain decisions, because stopping to the idea of, okay, this is irrational, these people are not fit for choices, it's a little too easy. It's a little too fast. And it seems in this case that these people did not receive, the parents did not receive psychological counseling. They were stuck into expenses that became bigger and bigger. Unfortunately, we have to consider also the financial gainings and the market that is behind neonatal care. So there were a number of unfair actions that were taken toward this young couple, and their numb behavior was somehow the justification for these actions. I think bioethics can do better in that sense. Also, what bioethics can do for emotional problems and emotional regulation is certainly connected to anxiety. Anxiety is a huge problem, is one of the biggest causes for unhappiness in the world today. In his sketches on emotions, Sartre described anxiety as a sort of a black hole that swallows everything, every emotions, every feeling that is around a human being. When you feel anxious, it's as if your real self is abandoning you because it's so afraid of the consequences of what is happening that, okay, the ego, the self, I'm not using these terms now in according to the psychological technical jargon, but your real self goes away and your body is alone, unsafe in this chaotic environment. And this happens quite often if you think about schools, for example, from the smallest example of learning languages, when you have to test yourself in something that feels really unsafe and unclear, and it's a new way of being, because I mean, speaking another language from your mother tongue means wearing clothes that do not fit quite yet, or the anxiety, simply the anxiety of going to school. Here I found these very interesting cases. Olimpia della Flora is the head master of a school in Columbus, Ohio, who realized that her students couldn't function in class because just the route to go to school was incredibly challenging, was incredibly stressful. They were, the school was welcoming a diverse population of students, and some of these students couldn't even have their own home. They were homeless, or they had a very chaotic environment at home, or just the route to go to school was very unsafe, and they had to protect themselves, look over their shoulders to arrive there safe. And so understanding the anxiety that is behind a human being can help you to create a more welcoming environment. And this headmaster was amazing in thinking of pedals under the table, so students could somehow riding while they were sitting on their table. They could move their body even though they were sitting at the table, or a soothing music, or decompression rooms before going to class, or a small toy to play with, to have an outlet for their anxiety. And their performances after these small changes skyrocketed. So sometimes bioethics, meaning this intersubjective cooperation of discipline, can help to create environments that are more functional. So, being sensitive to emotional problems can be conducive to healthier environment. So instead of normalizing anxiety, instead of normalizing narcissism, instead of normalizing stress, we should, in bioethics, work toward a more sensitive direction that can help us to fix those problems that are behind emotional distress. I don't know, another cases I considered in my book is solastalgia, which is a very interesting phenomenon, and it requires maybe more attention than the one I can give it now here in these videos. But solastalgia is a phenomenon that more or less we all experienced during this pandemic. And many of us, unfortunately, experience throughout life. So, nostalgia is basically the distress we feel when we lose our place. How can we lose our place? And what do we mean by place? We can lose our place because of violent natural disasters or chronic problems. So, I don't know, a tsunami or pollution. And by place here, I mean not just our physical home, but the sphere of belongingness where we can become ourselves, where we can unfold our potentialities. There are situations in which we suddenly develop exponential anxiety because we realize we lost our place. And this is happening today while I'm recording these videos because this pandemic obliged us to close ourselves into our homes, and so we lost our workplaces. We lost the church where where we were going to pray, the gyms where we were going to release our anxiety 2 or 3 times a week, or the parks where we were going to play with our friends, the restaurants where we were going to spend time together. So we lost our place of belongingness. And what do we do? Again, a sensitive bioethics, an integral bioethics should reflect on this problem and should provide a sensitive answer to the reconstruction of place. What is a place? How can I recreate the sense of belongingness? How can I help people suffering from anxiety to feel better and not normalizing this anxiety? There are ways, but clearly to put this in practice, we need to first consider the emotions behind and the black hole, as Sartre was saying, within which all these emotions tend to disappear. So again, I think that these are problems that we need to consider. I think that bioethics, since it is an interdisciplinary field of research, can do a lot to improve our well-being if only develops a more sensitive side to emotional problems and improve the practical legislative answers, but not only legislative, I mean theoretical also answers that can be given to certain problems. Being able already to see the problem instead of repressing it or saying that is irrational or discarding it because not relevant in that moment is already a step forward in a direction that can contribute to common well-being. So in the last chapter, I would propose I would give the answers to the brainstorming questions I raised at the beginning. I would propose a view of bioethics that I find interesting, a form of integrative phenomenological bioethics that is capable of looking at emotions and using emotions for its own well-being, for the growth of bioethic and for the growth of human beings and their environment as well. I hope you are enjoying this journey so far. I look forward to seeing you in our next and concluding chapter.